invitation and for the introduction. As Kevin said, it's been more than a year in the making to come here today because of conflicts and schedules and so forth, but I'm happy to be here. And I'm happy to talk about the book that I published last year, Citizens and Strangers, which basically I'm drawing from for this afternoon's lecture. And as Kevin said, if anybody is interested in following up, I have some copies afterward that I'd be happy to sign that I can sell for less than retail, so you get a discount and a signature that you won't be able to read. So it doesn't matter. I have to say as well that we planned this, I think about a year ago is when we finally set the date, or at least maybe 10 months or so ago. And of course, not anticipating that today would be the day when only one playoff spot in Major League Baseball. And fortunately, it's at 3:10. If it was at 12:40, I think I would have had the flu this weekend. Despite all the planning, you might have had to cancel. So you'll decide later whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. That'll be your judgment. As Kevin said, and as everybody's aware, we live in fractious times. And when I was working on this book, actually, I finished it in the summer of 2023. It was published in early 2024, which of course was an election year. That was the purpose. That was the plan, rather. We live in an even more fractious time now. And I'm not going to, in the hour or so that we're here this morning, I'm certainly not going to solve the problem of our fractious politics and our fractious social lives. But what I do intend to do, and hope that I can convince you of, is that we can't solve the problem using the current terms of American politics. And that if we, as Catholic Christians, really want to have a salient voice in the public square, it has to be to present a different way of thinking about politics than the continuum of American politics that we typically retreat to. And that's the thrust of the book, and that's the thrust of my prepared remarks this morning. In the midst of rapidly escalating changes in social norms and the laws, regulations, and judicial decisions that have followed them, the challenges of Catholic public witness in the United States have become increasingly difficult and vexatious. What might not be as obvious, however, is why we Catholics often seem to be ill-equipped to meet these social challenges or even to articulate a coherent response to them. Making matters worse, we Catholics often seem to be on mutually exclusive sides of cultural or political issues, with both thinking ours is the only possible position for a Catholic to hold. We Catholics cannot even convince one another of the rationale for many of our policy positions. And if we can't communicate with our fellow Catholics, it should be no surprise that we find ourselves mute oftentimes against the broader culture. Thus, we must first address the precarious situation as a symptom of the same basic problem, namely that we've abandoned or forgotten the moral language of Catholicism and replaced it with a moral language that leads inevitably to failure and frustration. We find it difficult to respond to non-Catholic or secular positions on public policy because we have largely accepted the basic moral anthropology, by which I mean the nature and purpose of the human person. The moral anthropology is the nature and purpose of the human person. We find it difficult to respond because we've largely accepted the moral anthropology of a foreign politics, of those alien points of view. In other words, we already have assented to foundational moral principles that give away the game before it even begins. Having conceded the fundamental moral theory, we find it difficult to articulate a justification for alternative practices to the practices of American politics and public life. For example, we Catholics almost universally argue that abortion is immoral because it infringes the, quote, right to life, unquote, of the unborn child. This is a concession that the language of individual subjective rights is the proper way to frame the argument about abortion. But then we are at a loss to articulate a principled reason why the rights of the unborn child should prevail over the rights claims of the woman, who considers that child to be an intrusion upon her own rights. We can see the basic moral philosophy informing the phrase, my body, my choice, and then wonder why women use it to rationalize ridding themselves of an intruder on her bodily autonomy. When such basic moral categories as inalienable rights, subjective individual rights, conflict, who are we to say whose should prevail and on what grounds? The problem is not limited to Catholic interactions with non-Catholics. Some, and I'll put in square quotes, pro-choice Catholics argue that their Catholic policy opponents advocate arbitrary limits to the scope of the subjective rights of women. This is because both sides have informed their basic moral positions from the same non-Catholic source that have refined particular policy positions in terms of American partisan loyalty rather than traditional Catholic morality. Put another way, the reason we Catholics find it difficult to speak to one another is because we have allowed ourselves to be informed by one of the two dominant variations of American liberalism, as sustained by the two dominant parties in the United States. Both these parties accept the same basic individualist principles, but merely differ on the details of how those principles should be applied. Having largely abandoned a Catholic understanding of the human person through this new anthropology of individualism, we can respond neither to those who hold it unapologetically, nor to those who are simply overwhelmed by it. That is to say, the American ethos of individualism. That's what I mean by it. So some who embrace it emphatically and enthusiastically, some feel there's something not quite right about it, but just are overwhelmed by it because the moral basis of American public life is individual rights claims, individual claims that we have against one another. Catholics on one side are happy with the practical implications of this theory, that is, they embrace it. Catholics on the other side are unhappy with the implications, but so thoroughly embedded in the theory that they cannot articulate a coherent political argument against it. And so we just raise our voices. The reason for this is that we Catholics have largely allowed ourselves to be formed by the liberal story of America rather than the biblical story of Catholic Christianity. Wishing to avoid living in conflict and with the moral and political theory that has formed American politics, law, and culture, we've tried to find an articulation of faith that is compatible with that American vision of politics, law, and culture. But instead of doing that, we have largely collapsed faith into the same political continuum, which we find frustrating to discuss within. The same political continuum of liberalism, and then we have staked out opposing positions on that continuum by its two extremes, which in American politics we call the left and the right. We share the faith of American liberalism, but simply differ in its implications according to our prior partisan commitments. It's not my intention to cast blame for this situation. And I know it sounds like, well, you know, this is a kind of a negative way to start the talk. I wish don't get your hopes up. It's not going to get any better. It's like Neil Young, one of Neil Young's live albums, right before he introduces Cowgirl in the Sand, he says, it starts out slow and kind of fizzles out altogether. Now, my talk doesn't fizzle out altogether, but it doesn't get any more optimistic, except to the extent that I do have some suggestions for how we can try to start to overcome and step outside of this continuum that is so vexatious. So it's not my intention to cast blame or to make judgments in favor of one side or the other. In many ways, this state of affairs is unsurprising and even sympathetic. We Catholic Christians want to live peaceably as American citizens, which we assume requires us to embrace and endorse the moral and political ideas that define and delimit what it means to be an American. We see the tension between faith and politics, to use shorthand, and think that we must find a resolution to the tension. And we have, by and large. But the cost of finding that resolution has been the integrity of our own theological witness. In one sense, of course, the problem of the relationship of Catholicism to broader cultural, civic, political, and legal life is not new. Indeed, it's as old as Christianity itself. While it is probably correct to see contemporary debate as especially contentious and even rancorous, the problems that underlie them are inherent in the very nature of Catholic faith and practice. Catholic discipleship is routinely described in expressly political terms. Christ the King, Mary, Queen of Heaven, God sits on his throne, Jesus at his right side. These political terms suggest that Catholics are subversive to authority that is potentially in tension with, if not contradicted by, other politics. This tension was at the heart, for example, of late 19th century anti-Catholic legislation and political rhetoric in the United States, characterized by such things as the so-called Blaine Amendments, statutes, and the editorial cartoons of people like Thomas Nast. I don't know if you're familiar with the so-called Blaine Amendments. These are amendments that about 30-some states in the U.S. have that make it illegal for public money to be used for any kind of religious purposes. And they oftentimes wind up being discriminatory. When James Blaine, the Massachusetts congressman, first proposed a constitutional amendment in the late 1860s, his purpose was indeed to protect the Protestant flavor of public schools and exclude any kind of Catholic influence on those schools. So it was founded, the Blaine Amendments, and that amendment failed, by the way, but many states took them up. We call these baby Blaine Amendments. And these are amendments that are designed to protect, as they're conceived, the state from any kind of religious influence. Of course, that doesn't happen because the religious influence is so prevalent to American public life that it's very hard to keep it out. But nonetheless, what Thomas Nast, the famous cartoonist from the 19th century, and Blaine saw was that a rigorously held Catholic moral theology has profound political implications. And the purpose of Blaine and others was to dilute that purpose such that the Catholic witness to God on his throne would not be subversive to the American political witness of our collective individual pursuits of individual interests. In response to these Catholic movements, to show that we can be good citizens, we Catholics gradually ceded the moral arguments that divide Catholic witness from American identity. To be accepted by the liberal and Protestant, and I'll define liberal and Protestant in a moment, to be accepted by the liberal and Protestant American culture, we Catholics have unwittingly accepted the basic moral principles that have informed that Protestant and liberal culture. In the process, however, we have forgotten the theologies and languages and practices that do indeed separate being Catholic from being a certain kind of American. In other words, our response to those who say that Catholics cannot be good Americans is to accept the moral theory that informs being a good American, but trying to carve out practical lives that contradict it by adhering to Catholic faith and practice. Thus, we Catholics in the United States have difficulty even talking to one another in authentically Catholic dialect. In fact, a typical American Catholic is more comfortable talking to a non-Catholic person with whom he otherwise identifies by political party than with his own Catholic brother or sister. We lack a coherent moral and political vocabulary, which means we Catholics have little hope of articulating principles of freedom and common good to the broader culture, because we don't even know what that looks like within the church. This is the case for at least two reasons. First, we've forgotten the language of the Catholic moral life. Second, we have reduced moral commitments to political identity, and political identity has been further reduced to party loyalty. Thus, our moral and political lives as Catholics are often more likely formed by partisan identification than Catholic discipleship. That's because we have tended to reduce our moral lives to our political identities and partisan loyalties to such a degree that we think that it's the same thing as our Catholic identities. We've subordinated the language of the Church, the language of Catholic moral life, to political identification to such a degree that we are largely left without the ability or the tools to distinguish between the moral principles that animate our secular republic and those that animate Christian discipleship. My goal is to challenge you to think about recovering a Catholic moral language through what are sometimes called the four pillars of Catholic social doctrine: human dignity, subsidiarity, solidarity, and common good. Each of these principles can be learned as a better way than thinking about a whole host of social and civic issues, including legal, political, economic, and broader social issues. From abortion to immigration, from healthcare to capital punishment, from contraception to euthanasia. We Catholics have a moral language that is richer, deeper, and more comprehensive than the language of liberal Protestantism, to which we often default. The language of Catholic social doctrine does not undermine very political anthropology at the heart of Catholic understanding of the human person. So what we must do then is to recover a moral grammar, idiom, and vocabulary that are formed by Catholic moral doctrine rather than by liberal political theory. I am fully aware that this may be a quixotic effort, but the effort is worth the hope that we Catholics might once again be a witness to the integrity of faith rather than participants in its demise. As I tell my students, I'm happy to be Don Quixote, and you can be Sancho Panzas, and by God, we'll tilt at those windmills until they're defeated in those herds of swine and so forth and so forth. To sum it up, not the top, the top. I thought you were going to get out of here. We are all liberal Protestants before we are Catholic Christians. Thus, to form our moral lives as Catholics is a constant battle to overcome the liberal Protestantism that we consume with our mother's milk. Now, by liberal, I don't mean what anybody in this room thinks I mean by it. So let me tell you what I mean by it. By liberal, I do not mean the way that someone on the left end of the spectrum of American politics would identify himself, or by which others would identify him. Rather, by liberal, I mean the basic moral anthropology that animates the entirety of the political spectrum in the United States, from the far left of the Democrat Party to the far right of the Republican Party. This is characterized by at least two elements shared by all who are on this continuum from the right to the left. One, radical personal autonomy, and two, an absolute commitment to individualism characterized by recourse to a language of individual rights as the basic moral foundation, or indeed as the only foundation for some moral action. These two elements, radical personal autonomy and absolute commitment to individual rights, these two elements are not merely contrary to Catholic understanding of the human person, but corrosive of it. Defined in this way, the overwhelming majority of Americans are liberals, whether of the left progressive variety or the right conservative variety. You can think about it in a couple of different ways. You have liberal liberals and conservative liberals. You have progressive liberals and conservative liberals. But it's all variations on the same. It's all dialects of the same basic moral language. These are merely variations on the theme: left progressive or right conservative. They're intrafamilial disagreements. Thus, when I use the term liberal or liberalism, I'm not referring to what we usually regard in the U.S. as the political left. or the Democratic Party. Rather, I'm referring to the political theory that forms and informs the moral and political lives of virtually all Americans. In this theory, every human relationship is reduced to contractual agreements, whether implicit or explicit, by autonomous moral actors. This is another way of saying that the human person is naturally individual and isolated from every other human person. In this theory, there are no natural associations. All associations are conventional, arrived at by mutual agreement between two people possessing absolute claims against the other. All associations are contractual transactions in which we trade or reserve our absolute rights of conscience and action in exchange or abstention to the rights and consciences of other radically individual persons. The human person in this view is not naturally social, but rather, and there are no natural social institutions. All institutions are arrived at by agreement and convention. In liberalism, all human associations are conventional, formed by the agreement of autonomous individuals. And because all institutions are voluntary and contractual, there is never any moral obligation to conform to any. In other words, we make this implicit social contract, but because there's no overarching principle enforcing the contract, we feel free to abandon it when it becomes inconvenient, because we reserve our absolute possessive individual rights claims against one another. So that's what I mean by liberal. By Protestant, I mean at least two things. First, a tendency to identify the church as yet one voluntary institution among others, created by nothing other than the wills of its members, none of which are answerable to an institutional church beyond the extent that they choose. Now, that's a description of Protestantism, but it's also a description of the way that many Catholics think about their relationship to the church. Let me read it again. A tendency to identify the church as yet one voluntary institution among others, created by nothing other than the wills of its members, the collective wills of its members, none of which are answerable to the church beyond the extent that we choose to be. Second, what I mean by liberalism is a tendency to think of the church as making moral admonitions and encouragements, but with no more purchase over our actual moral commitments than we decide to give it. Again, that's a Protestant understanding of church. But once again, I think that many of you will see that that's exactly how many Catholics also think about the church themselves. This is because we reduce morality to individual subjective rights, that is, claims that we have by being made in the image and likeness of God. I like to tell my students, one of the things that we use the word unalienable in our very founding document. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are the pursuit of life, liberty. Among these are the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. Well, what if that's false? What if the very notion of unalienable individual rights is a false articulation of the human person? I happen to think that it is false. That we're not endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, but rather that we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable dignity. And by starting with that, it puts us on a completely different trajectory than a language of possessive individual rights claims, which, by the way, didn't even occur to anybody until about the 16th century. Thus, like actual Protestants and evangelicals, our relative commitment to the moral teaching of the church is often mere coincidence. We reserve our actual personal commitments to our autonomous individual consciences, which is independent of any authoritative magisterium. Individual subjective conscience, in both its formation and application, therefore always trumps the church's teaching. We reserve that right. Because why? Because we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these are the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. When we do agree with the church's teaching, this is nothing but serendipity. When we disagree, which is all right, we follow our own autonomous conscience without any consequence. If the church presumes to correct us, we dissent or leave. This is not an expression of the Catholic teaching that conscience must be obeyed. Rather, it is the Protestant theory that conscience cannot err. Together, liberalism and Protestantism are the political and religious names that we give to the same basic moral anthropology. A moral anthropology that, at best, is in tension with Catholic discipleship, and at worst is contrary and incompatible with it. It is based in individual rights, radical voluntarism, and privatized morality. Now, for many people, those are all wonderful things, right? Those are all that, yes, many people say, yes, absolutely, we affirm those things. And that's fine. It's not an irrational point of view, but it's not rational. To put it in a straightforward way, this is the faith of a very large number of American Catholics. We American Catholics are sometimes liberal before we are Catholic. Thus, we subscribe to and practice the moral and political language of liberalism as the foundation and structure of our religious, moral, and political lives. Specific Catholic moral teaching may fill some gaps, but these doctrines are subordinate and thus answerable to our own autonomous consciences, which have largely been formed by our partisan political commitments. And among my favorite novels, and Kevin mentioned that I often incorporate literature, poetry, music, and stories into my writing. Among my favorite novels is a series of 20 novels by the late British novelist Patrick O'Brian, popularly known as the Aubrey Maturin series. If you've seen the Russell Crowe film, Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World, that's an adaptation, basically from one of the 20 novels, but it brings in scenes and vignettes and lines of dialogue from several others. But the basic story in Master and Commander, which is a wonderful film, by the way, is drawn from one of these novels. The novels follow the lives and careers of an early 19th century British Navy ship's captain named Jack Aubrey, and his best friend and erstwhile ship's surgeon, Stephen Maturin. The novels take Captain Aubrey and Dr. Maturin to the farthest reaches of the planet from their native England and back again. Again, this is basically during the Napoleonic Wars and into the War of 1812 with the U.S. In one of the novels, The Nutmeg of Consolation, Aubrey and Maturin lay in at the harbor of a small, fictional Melanesian island called Sweeting's Island. There, they discovered that the entire population, save 2 young girls about ages 5 and 6, had died from a smallpox epidemic, probably brought to the island by British or American whalers. When Dr. Maturin discovered the girls, they were near starvation and barely spoke. As O'Brian describes the initial discovery, the girls, quote, the girls' minds were stunned, not so much by terror or grief, but more by utter bewilderment and comprehension when they met these white men from this ship that had landed in their island. They could not understand what had happened to them, that is to say, all the people around them had died, nor who or what these white men were who had appeared from the sea. After determining that there were no other survivors on the island, Dr. Maturin takes the girls on board the ship with the hope of placing them in a foster or adoption home in New South Wales, what we now call Australia, on the way home, or failing that, upon return to England. To communicate with the girls, who Dr. Maturin named Emily and Sarah, Dr. Maturin began to teach the girls English, the progress of which, as O'Brian describes it, was extraordinarily rapid. Indeed, observed one officer, within a short time the girls, quote, already spoke with a broad West Country burr on the forecastle, and in quite another English dialect on the quarterdeck. Indeed, it is so impressive and rapid, that is their learning language, So impressive at Rapid was their ability to speak these dialects of English that Captain Aubrey surmised, quote, "It seems to me that they are forgetting their own language. You never hear them hallooing to one another in foreign as they used to," unquote. This elicited another officer to wonder, quote, "Could you ever forget your own language? Languages you have learned, like Latin and Greek, yes, but your own," unquote. Brian does not provide an answer in the form of further dialogue, but rather through the narrator's description of Dr. Maturin's own linguistic journey. Now, Dr. Maturin is the most, I think, the most fascinating character in these novels. He was born in Ireland to Castilian and Irish parents, and he was raised mostly in Ireland and Spain, and educated in France. He's a polyglot in addition to being a surgeon. By the way, the film is very good, but the portrayal of Dr. Maturin in the film is completely different from the book. Completely different. It's a different character altogether. But that's fine. I understand what you have to do that sometimes. So Dr. Maturin grew up speaking with native fluency dialects of Spanish, Irish, Gaelic, English, and French. So what O'Brien does is he describes the process of learning and forgetting languages through Dr. Maturin's experience. Quote, "At one time, he had nearly forgotten his native Irish, the first language he ever spoke, having been fostered in the County Clare. And although it had surged up from the depths these last years when he spoke it, there were still words, and quite commonplace words too, whose sounds were perfectly familiar, but whose meaning escaped him entirely." So that's his native Irish language. Finding Sarah and Emily a home in New South Wales failed, and the story of that attempt is actually quite hilarious. So Emily and Sarah were taken to England. By the time that they had arrived, nearly a year later, right? They're going from the South Pacific to England by way of Australia. So nearly a year later, they arrived in England. By the time they arrived, as described in a subsequent novel called The Commodore, quote, "Emily and Sarah had entirely forgotten the language of Sweden's island, apart from counting it as they skipped. But they spoke perfect English, quarterdeck with never an oath, or the much more earthy and emphatic lower deck version as occasion required." That is, they had learned two dialects of English, the proper and formal language of the officer's deck, and the, shall we say, saltier dialect of the enlisted seamen in the forecastle and below decks. But in the process, Emily and Sarah, 5-6 years old, had forgotten, except the rote recitation of some numbers in a game, had forgotten their native language. They no longer spoke, presumably thought in, or presumably even understood their native tongue. Their language had been reduced to two dialects of the ambient language of a 19th century man of war. What happened to Sarah and Emily is what has happened to us Catholics in the United States. We have learned to speak the language of liberal Protestantism, either the Democrat or Republican dialects, and I'll let each of you decide which is the dialect of the forecastle, which of the quarterdeck. That's you do that yourself. I say pox to all of them. We've learned to speak the language of liberal Protestantism, by the dialect, but other than rote words and phrases, we have somehow forgotten how to speak or even to think Catholic. In our attempt to be coherent or relevant, we use the same words but change their meanings to something that is far removed from what was meant when the venerable concepts were developed. Put another way, if we speak Catholic, we're not understood in the public square. If we speak the language of the public square, we're not speaking Catholic. Rather, our language has been reduced to the liberal Protestantism, as I defined it earlier, that is spoken both on the quarterdeck and in the forecastle. this makes it very difficult for us to speak coherently about Catholic moral doctrine, especially that branch that we call social doctrine. But we cannot be truly relevant to anyone. We Catholics cannot be relevant to anyone unless we learn, speak, promulgate, and defend the language of the Church, affirming the dignity of the human person and the doctrines of solidarity, subsidiarity, and common good. What do I mean by that? Very briefly, and I'll close by defining and saying a couple of things about what I call the 4 pillars of Catholic social doctrine. Now, I say I call it, I'm certainly not original in that. You'll sometimes see Catholic social doctrine as described by the 4 pillars, which I just mentioned, dignity, solidarity, subsidiarity, and common good, which I'll talk about a little bit this afternoon. Sometimes you'll hear the 7 themes of Catholic social doctrine, which is fine. These are basically just more granular articulations of the 4 pillars. So I'm giving a talk tomorrow night. Today's Sunday, tomorrow night on the west side of Our Lady of Lourdes, where I'm introducing these four themes to introduce a series that they're doing without me. The 7 themes later on. So these four pillars, what I call the pillars of Catholic social doctrine. The first is dignity. It's important that we understand at the outset that dignity is one of those words that has largely been co-opted by and filled with meaning that is different from the meaning that we Catholics give to dignity, or the way that we understand human dignity. First of all, I'll start with the way that it often is defined in American public life, and broadly speaking in Western public life. And what people often mean by dignity is some set number, some collection of individual attributes, absent which X number of those attributes, dignity is absent as well. And the reason that it's often defined that way is precisely to defend doing away with someone who is judged by one culture or another not to have enough of those attributes, those external attributes by which we judge them to have dignity. So severe injury, illness, accidents, conditions that are unavoidable, that all compromise our moral agency. Old age, feeling that one more and more every day. We tend to think that, or not we, and I dare say that this is one thing that we Catholics are better at, I think, than some others. But generally speaking, the broader culture defines dignity by these external attributes. And if you don't have some of them, or if you don't have enough of them, then you don't have the kind of dignity by which you deserve to be kept alive, for example. And so this is the argument that's used for euthanasia. And you know, you hear these arguments in other countries and in some states in this country. You know, the so-called medical assistance in dying, the MAID laws in Canada, in which they say, oh, no, it's not going to be, nobody's ever going to be forced to do this. But, you know, a week later, people are being basically forced. And why is it? Because they don't have dignity. We Catholics understand dignity to be something very, very different from that. If we want to use the word unalienable, let's not use it for subjective, possessive rights claims against each other, but rather let's use the term unalienable to describe the dignity that inheres in the human person by virtue of being made in the image and likeness of God. And because it's unalienable, it can never be taken away. That's not to say that we can't act in such a way that compromises our dignity. Certainly we can, and we do. But the dignity itself is inherent in the human person made in the image and likeness of God and cannot be taken away. Regardless of how heinous a crime we might commit, how relatively incapacitated we are, where we live, if we have a place to live, all of those things are external, but none of those things compromise the dignity by which we're made by being created in the image and likeness of God as God's own creatures who he made for his own pleasure and joy. So we have to recover a language of dignity. And this is one of those areas where secular the secular world uses the term, we don't have another term, so we have to reclaim the definition. Dignity implies at least two things for my purposes, or I'm going to talk here. Transcendence and moral agency. By transcendence, I mean that the human person alone has the capacity to reflect upon his own existence, the meaning of existence, and to reflect upon the relationship with others, about which I'll talk about that in a minute. I have a 5-year-old black lab named Onyx. I love him. We have one kid left in the house. My son Henry, who's 18. We're looking at colleges. And he's getting ready to go to college, and that's all going to be great. And then when he is gone, all we'll have left is Onyx, which in many ways, never mind. Keep forgetting this being recorded. Onyx is a really smart dog. You know, he's a purebred lab, and he does, and he's eager to please. You know, again, going back to what I almost said, eager to please, always obedient, does what you tell him. But here's what Onyx doesn't do. He doesn't sit around thinking about the nature of being a dog. Never had that thought, pretty sure. Although it does remind me of the one about the dyslexic agnostic who sat around all night wondering about the existence of dogs. Some of you saw that coming. Yeah. There's no rotten tomatoes over there. And the second is moral agency. Transcendent human dignity implies moral agency. That we alone, among all God's creatures, have the ability to reflect and to make moral choices. That's inherent in what it means to have dignity. And we alone. We don't ascribe moral agency to animals. We might ascribe moral transgression to the way we treat animals, right? But we never, even if the most vicious animal attacks a person or another animal, no one ever uses moral terms to describe that action. We reserve moral judgment to the actions of human beings who, because of our dignity, are able to make moral choices. Second, solidarity. Genesis 1 and 2 are the basis of all Catholic moral theology. In fact, I return to Genesis 1 and 2 more than any other text in the Bible, because Genesis 1 and 2 give us so much information about who we are. And one of the things that Genesis 1 and 2 tell us in two completely different ways, two completely different literary styles, is that we are social creatures. That in Genesis 1:27, God creates man and woman in his image. Male and female, he created them. Created two. The male and female, for our purposes, doesn't matter. He created two. Why did he do that? Or what does that tell us? It tells us that the human person is social in his very nature. Genesis 2 approaches it in a different way. Different story, different time, different way of telling the story. And that is, God created one, but it wasn't complete. It wasn't complete until, in fact, God even said it's not complete. And the one needs a suitable partner. The animals were not suitable partners for reasons that I just discussed. And so he created another. And again, the gender doesn't matter at this point. What matters is the community. And therefore, we know that human nature, the very nature of what it means to be human, is to be in solidarity with others, to live in communion with others, and to know ourselves in relation to others. Not to assert rights claims against one another, but to understand the obligations to one another that adheres in the very nature of solidarity. I don't know myself apart from you, nor you apart from me. We're known in relationship to one another, and that necessarily implies that our very beings are interrelated in such a way that gives lie to the notion of possessive individualism. Third, subsidiarity. Subsidiarity comes from the Latin word to help, to assist, to subsidize. And basically it means that in preservation of moral agency, social problems should be addressed at the most local and the smallest level possible. We call these the proximate standard and the location standard. However, and this is my more important point, the point of subsidiarity is not the size and proximity, important as that is. size and proximity are at the service of help. The doctrine of subsidiarity is not primarily about size and proximity. It's primarily about help. The size and proximity elements are merely the way that we approach questions about the best social policy for fulfilling our obligations to one another. In other words, as I like to tell my students, subsidiarity is not Catholic libertarianism, right? Because you often hear that, small government and all this stuff. Sometimes subsidiarity is served by large and remote government. Sometimes it's served by small and local. And those are prudential questions that have to be addressed in a case-by-case basis. Okay. Subsidiarity, to help, to aid, or to subsidize. And that applies to social welfare, to childbirth. In the book, I advocate free birth as an example of solidarity and subsidiarity. A federal program, which I don't believe violates subsidiarity, because children are goods, are public goods. They're goods not just for the parents who have them, but for society. We look at the declining birth rate in the U.S. Right now, our average is about 1.6 births per woman. The replacement rate is 2.1, and we see this in all of Western Europe and much of Asia. And it's already creating social and economic crises. As populations age and children are not coming up to adults to keep tax revenues going and to keep economies running, we already are seeing, and we're behind a little bit, countries like, for example, Japan and countries in Europe, but we're catching up. And subsidiarity, among other things, I argue in the book, is consistent with a federal policy encouraging births. I have several examples of how to do that. And then finally, the common good. The common good is the most difficult to define. And in fact, I won't go into the details about it now, but I usually define common good by what we sometimes call differential diagnoses. If you know anything about medicine, if you're a physician or a healthcare worker, you know what a differential diagnosis is. You take a list of symptoms. The symptoms might be consistent with one of 3 diseases, and then you start eliminating diseases by identifying what symptoms are not part of X or Y disease or condition. And then you wind up with your best guess about what really is going on, and that's what you treat. Common good is much like that. It's easier to say what it's not. It's not simply the collection of individual goods, right? Because that, again, keeps us in the continuum of individualism. It's not simply the collection of, it's not simply the status of financial well-being, important as that is. Economic life is important to the common good. Rather, common good, as the Catechism describes it, is the sum total of material, spiritual, and moral conditions that are conducive to the development of the whole person. Put another way, common good are those goods that can be shared without being divided. Can be shared without being divided. Oftentimes, common good calls us individuals to understand that the good of the whole is greater than my individual desires. It can never be done if it's truly common good, and if it's truly search. It can never be done coercively from the top down, but rather has to emerge from the consensus of Catholic witness. So the way that I summarize common good is this. If we truly can institutionalize dignity, subsidiarity, and solidarity, then the only thing that could possibly emerge from that is a commitment to common good. Because common good is the summary of those things. So that's the language that we need to recover. We need to find a way to stop speaking Protestant liberal individualism and start learning to think Catholic social doctrine. As I argue in one piece I wrote some time ago, all moral doctrine is social doctrine, because all moral choices are connected to the moral choices of others. That's solidarity. We introduce that through human dignity, we observe it through subsidiarity, and the result is common good. If we Catholics want to be relevant, it won't be by compromising our language to the regnant political, moral, and cultural language around us. If we want to be relevant, it will be by a recovery of our own moral language, which is richer, deeper, and far more far-reaching than the liberalism which has formed our moral lives. And I would be happy to take questions. Yes, Bob.
I'm going to ask a personal question of you that might shade some of the other things you've been saying. Thank you for choosing 4 pillars. I get the 7, and I've often taught it as 9.
There you go.
Let me tell you my personal story first, and if you could share briefly your own, because I'll bet you it's interesting, and so I'm curious about it. On May 8th, last May 8th, I was with a bunch of high school kids. We were watching the internet to see who would be elected Pope. Well, then Prevost comes out, and we're like, Chicago, great, great, great. It wasn't until maybe, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes later, he comes out and they announce his name. And the kids all thought, oh, great, American Pope, American Pope. I said, do you guys know what choosing Leo means? Well, they didn't. So I had a teachable moment to say something about Leo the 13th and why. I'm curious, what did you think when that happened? American and Catholic social teaching by choosing?
Well, I never have a thought that I don't write about. So I think it was in our Sunday Visitor, but it might have been the Catholic Herald. I write a monthly column for the Catholic Herald, which is a UK publication. I did until this week write a weekly column for our Sunday Visitor, but our Sunday Visitor is ceasing publication. And I write, for the Telegraph. I don't know where I wrote this, but I wrote about it, and in fact, my reaction was one of optimism.
Where were you?
Where was I? Where was I? Here's where I was, Father. This is great. I was, when it was first announced, the white smoke was announced,
yeah.
I was in a dentist chair. That's true. When his name was announced, I was in a barber chair. 2 different chairs, by the way.
Better than the electric chair.
Used to be that was the same chair. It's 2 different chairs now. As a matter of fact, I was watching it, and the woman was cutting my hair, and I said, "Oh, I gotta watch this. You have to excuse me. This is a professional obligation. I gotta." And yes, I was thrilled because, and the article that I wrote connected it to 2 popes. Pope Leo the 13th, of course, because Leo the 13th is the father of Catholic social doctrine. His landmark encyclical in 1891 called Rerum Novarum was what we basically call the beginning of Catholic social doctrine. And basically what we mean by that is applying Catholic moral reflection to the new problems of the Industrial Revolution and the poverty and the disconnect, the alienation, all of those things that Karl Marx identified as social pathologies, but whose prescription for fixing it were obviously very wrong. And that's so. And then Leo the First. Because Leo the First, for 2 reasons that I think that he chose that name, the 2 reasons, the 2 things that I highlight about Leo the First. The first is the Tome of Leo, the great announcement that we affirm today of the 2 natures of Christ. It was Pope Leo's so-called Tome of Leo, which articulated the 2 natures of Christ that became the Church's go-to doctrine. And second, his through diplomacy, turning away Attila. And almost single-handedly, it's one of the great mysteries, actually, of political history, is what he said, without bloodshed, to basically save Rome from being sacked. Got sacked later, but at least St. Augustine wasn't quite so successful. But yeah, that's a good question, and I was thrilled to hear Leo the 13th. Now, there's a little bit more to it, and I don't want to go too long. And the other thing is the Americanism. So several years ago, I wrote an article called "The Phantom Redivivus," revisiting the Americanist controversy. And because if you're familiar with the controversy in the late 19th century, Pope Leo XIII thought that there were things about American public life that were not compatible with Catholic moral theology, and he wrote a letter to the bishops. Bishop Ireland in St. Paul was the most important sort of recipient of it. And Bishop Ireland said, "Oh yes, you're exactly right. If those things existed, then that would be a very bad thing." But they don't. Well, the fact is they do, and they do even more now than they did then. And in fact, I think that Pope Leo XIII's criticism or observations about American public life were spot on and are still as relevant today as they were then, which is why I wrote this article, The Phantom Redivivus, that is reviving the phantom of Americans. Because some people call it a phantom heresy that didn't exist. Thank you. Anything else? We've got plenty of time. The game doesn't start till 3:10.
Say again the title of this series of 20 books.
Oh, well, they're called the Aubrey Maturin series. Jack Aubrey is Captain Aubrey, and Stephen Maturin, Maturin. They're called, and the first book is the Commodore. The first one is called the Commodore, and then it's Patrick O'Brien, but it's spelled O-B-R-I-A-N, not E-N. Patrick O'Brien. Wonderful books. It took me a long time to get to them, and when I finally did, because a friend of mine for like 15 years had said, you really need to read these books, and when I finally did, they said, what took you so long? I said, fear of commitment. I saw another hand. Yes.
You speak of American social, this is in Catholic and American social theology. Do you think there's any society out there that's getting it right?
No. In North Canterbury, because on this side of the African. However, we have to be careful about that, because what I said near the end about subsidiarity can't be forced upon us, or solidarity also can't be forced upon. It has to emerge spontaneously through the choices of moral agents. But we also understand that there's always an admixture. You know, when St. Augustine wrote his great book, The City of God, he talked about the earthly city and the city of God as coexisting. And the task of Christians is to identify those, what I call false narratives from the city, the earthly city, that try to make claims upon our consciences and our moral vocabulary, which are part of the city of God, Civitas Dei versus the Civitas Terrain. So, having said that, we also want to be careful that we never identify any particular politics with Catholic faith and practice. One of the things that we have to understand about, and one of the glories of Catholicism, Christianity more generally, is that it's what I call a portable faith, right? It's not tied to any particular geographic, demographic, political, or social existence. We can be we can speak lots of languages, live in lots of places, live in lots of different kinds of political regimes. We don't prescribe them, we judge them. And so what I mean by that, and one of my students said one time when I was teaching this, he said, so really in a sense it's kind of a negative theology, in the sense that because the church is very careful to say we don't prescribe a particular politics. We don't prescribe a particular economics. What we do is use the good of the human person, the flourishing of the human person, as hermeneutic lenses, interpretive lenses, to make judgments about the relative justice of any particular political regime. Some we might say are closer, and some are farther apart. My problem with the American experiment, in fact, I wrote an article just a couple of weeks ago called "Has Our Experiment in Ordered Liberty Failed?" This was right after the Charlie Kirk assassination. Has our experiment in ordered liberty failed? And unfortunately, my conclusion is that it has failed, and I have lots of empirical evidence. So, and the reason this is a special problem for me, is that it starts with that fundamentally false moral anthropology of individualism. If you start there, then you can't find the right path. You know, I analogize it to, speaking of 19th century navigating, before, GPS and radar and sonar, the way that you navigated on the open seas was by the stars, right? You had a sextant, you pull down the sun. I have no idea what that means, but it's just something that they say. You pull down the sun, you take your bearings, and away you go. Well, what's key to that, of course, is finding the right star. If you're mistaken about the star, every decision you make is going to take you farther away from your desired destination rather than closer to it. If we start with an improper moral anthropology, it literally, and when I say literally, unlike a lot of people, I mean literally, not metaphorically. It literally drives me nuts when people do that. But But we start with that individual psychology. We cannot construct a just social society, just political, economic, and social structures if we begin with moral anthropology of possessive individualism and client science.
And I guess that's what I'm saying, that there are some
Yes.
societies out there that are community-minded versus individual.
And to that extent, I would say that that's a better way. And just very briefly, and I know we're a little bit over time, and please, I know it's Sunday afternoon. Don't hesitate. The Bengals don't play till tomorrow night, so there's no 1 o'clock they should leave here. So if people need to leave, I won't be offended. Yeah, I think that's the case. And so I think what our task is and what the project I'm trying to sort of pursue in all this is for us Catholics to at least to be a counter community or a counter language. When Simeon met the pregnant Virgin Mary, pregnant with Jesus, he said that he will be a sign of contradiction. That prophetic voice about Jesus should apply to all of us. I mean, being a Christian means being a little Christ. That was a derogatory term in the early church. And we're not a sign of contradiction in American public life, which is exactly what my talk has been claiming. We need to be a sign of contradiction by reviving that kind of culture. Anything else? Yeah.
I guess a question here with, this idea of the rejection of this individualist perspective to this community, this idea of enabling dignity is that we are a multicultural nation, right? We do have a lot of
Yes.
perspectives in this world
Yes.
here. And my concern is that we go from this rejection of the individual
Yeah.
to this community base,
Yeah.
that there's this fear and tension that which community
Yeah.
is here.
So-
And I think that's kind of why the individual has existed,
Right.
protections for individual communities.
And it's a good question, and it's a question that I often hear, and so since I hear it often, I have a reverse answer. to put your question in another way, the question is who decides, right?
Yeah.
The answer is someone. And it's no different in a liberal society than any other kind of society. The difference is that Enlightenment liberalism tells us that no one decides, but that's a decision. It tells us that we're free to pursue our own individual goods because it punts on the question of collective good or common good. That's a decision. That's a judgment. That's a decision about the proper functioning of society. So somebody decides. In other words, I'm not afraid of that because somebody's already decided. An article I wrote several weeks ago now, there's no, what's so great about free speech? And what I suggest in there is that, it sounds, what, you don't believe in free speech? Well, the short answer is no, I don't. Not that I don't believe that it would be a good, but that there is no such thing. Because somebody decides the parameters of acceptable speech. Somebody decides. The question is who. Now, your question, then we can pursue your question, but it would take a semester. There's a question over here about
Someone decides.
someone decides.
And you also speak of Catholics being marginalized and if we want to be heard. Gorsuch, Comey Barrett, they don't have a false understanding of anthropology, do they?
Well,
Kavanaugh, Roberts,
well, okay, so I
how
have
many
to,
marginalized do we have with supermajority Supreme Court on our side?
I haven't said, well, first of all, you used a term that I didn't use and wouldn't use because I don't believe. You said marginalized. We're not marginalized. We need to be marginalized. The problem is we're not, right? The problem is we're not marginalized because we have made ourselves too at home. So, and so with the justice that we talked about, Gorsuch can't be considered the same as Barrett, can't be his name is Roberts or Kavanaugh. Because all of them, if you read their decisions, especially Gorsuch on a particular decision from a few years ago from Michigan, articulated a moral anthropology that is precisely what I've been criticizing. And we could go back, actually. We could go back to Justice Anthony Kennedy, who wrote one of the most notorious anti-Catholic sentences in the history of the Supreme Court, in which he said, at the heart of existence is the right to define one's own concept of reality. Now, I'm gonna use a technical theological term here to describe that. Bullshit. That is so foreign to what it means to be a Catholic Christian. And Justice Kennedy, as it was.
I didn't mention him either. I mentioned Gorsuch.
I know, I'm just.
John Finney's students are a little bit different.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. So my point is that, yes, there are Catholics on the Supreme Court. I think that Barrett probably, just from, and by this, I'm just going by her confirmation hearing, and things that I know about her from other people, because we have some mutual friends, she's from South Bend, or well, at least lived in South Bend for many years, she taught in Notre Dame. My daughter lives in South Bend. I have some friends. Actually, let me plug something that's coming up next month. I don't know the exact date, but you can find it on the AFMA website. Richard Garnett, one of, I think, the preeminent legal scholar on church and state issues, is speaking at Mount St. Mary's Seminary sometime in October. It's called the Gardner Lecture. It's the same. My chair is funded by the Gardner Foundation, and the Gardner Foundation also sponsors a lectureship in Richard Garnett, and I think that you'd be interested in that. Possibly. If you have a follow-up.
Well, let's go with, nobody's mentioned any of the human rights until the 16th century. We've been reading this week in the Book of Ezra, King Cyrus, and 600 BC says ladies worship before the king's own gods.
Yeah.
Seems to predate 16th century.
Yeah, but you don't have, what you don't have and this is just an observation, it's not a contention. What you don't have until the 16th century is any notion that we have rights claims that are possessed by nature and that are claimed against one another. See, I'm not suggesting at all anything that would be contradictory to that, let a person worship according to his conviction. What I'm suggesting is that needs to be rooted in a different way of approaching the question generally, such that it's protection of moral agency, because religion is a virtue, right? Religion is a virtue, which is a species of the genus of justice. In order to commit a virtue, we have to be free. We have to have free moral agency. Otherwise, you can't commit a virtue. You can't be virtuous by accident. You can't be virtuous by coercion. You can only be virtuous by free moral action, reflection, and choice, and so forth. And that's what translates in that type of thinking. And that's not contrary to anything that I would suggest. It's just that it's rooted in protection of moral agency rather than in protection of rights.
When you were introduced and they talked about your educational background, they mentioned that you have a law degree. Did that come before your PhD, or what? And what was your motivation for getting a law degree?
Money. Cold, hard cash.
Got 9 kids?
Exactly. No, my PhD came first. My intention since I was a teenager was to teach theology. Now, something happened along the way that kind of interrupted that. Namely, I converted from evangelicalism to Catholicism after I finished my evangelical seminary here in Cincinnati. And then had been invited back to teach after I finished my PhD at Boston College. That invitation was rescinded after I converted. So my PhD from BC was first. I taught for 5 years, taught full time for 5 years in San Antonio at St. Mary's University. I had 5 children. There was more money coming in, or going out than coming in. And to be perfectly honest, the work that I was doing was this type of work. And the people who were teaching in the law school doing basically the same thing I were doing were being paid a hell of a lot more money than I was to do it. So I said, let's get a law degree. So I packed up my, at the time, 5 children in San Antonio, drove them to Durham, North Carolina, and had a 6th child there, and then the 3 others were born here. But I said money. That was a big part of it. And so, but I wasn't intending to practice. But I did. I practiced, and I still have a small solo practice. But since I started teaching full time, I don't take new clients. I don't do any more hourly work. I just have some retainer clients just to sort of keep the coffers full. But that's the way it went. And so I practiced at a large firm here in town, a couple large firms here in town. What was then Squire Sanders and Dempsey is now the name now. and at Ulmer and Burnham, it's also a different name now, and then went out on my own. So, but it's a good question. I'm actually, I'm giving a talk next week, which is going to be even more interesting in terms of reactions, I think, because I'm giving a talk after the Dayton Lawyers Guild, Catholic Lawyers Guild in Dayton is a new chapter, is having their first celebration of the Red Mass next Friday, and they've asked me to speak afterwards, and so I'm going to stand up there and tell all these fellow lawyers why how hard it should be to be a lawyer in the U.S. And if it's not hard for them to be a lawyer in the U.S., then they haven't thought about it deeply enough. And Father Archbishop Casey is sitting in that, so I won't use any technical theological terms. Any other presidents? All right. If anybody is interested in purchasing the book, I did bring some with me, and I'll be happy to sign them. The retail price is $27. I can sell them for $20, and you can again get my signature, Venmo or Apple Cash or cash if you want it. Obviously, don't feel obligated, but I'll sit down at the table someplace and pull them out.
All right.
But thank you very much.
Ken, thank you so much.